So the U.S. Commerce Secretary went on stage the other day and said Canada sucks, right before admitting that the trade war is costing the United States over $1 billion a month. If that's what winning sounds like, I'd hate to hear losing.
Yeah, this is one of those moments where the tone tells you more than the policy. When a $30 trillion economy starts name-calling its closest trading partner, well, that's not a strategy. It's pure frustration.
And that frustration is showing. Howard Lutnick basically just handed Canada the most powerful weapon in this trade war, and he doesn't even know that he did it. The weapon has been sitting there the whole time. Washington just couldn't see it because they were too busy counting percentages.
So he stood in front of cameras and made the case that Canada was vulnerable because 76% of Canadian exports go south. The U.S. was supposed to look unbeatable, but what he actually did was tell the world exactly where the pressure points are.
Canada didn't just find its leverage, Washington revealed it, and that's what we're going to cover today.
So let's set the scene. Lutnick is the U.S. Commerce Secretary. He gave an interview laying out what he called the fundamental imbalance between the U.S. and Canada.
Yeah, his argument was straightforward. Canada sends 76% of its exports to the United States. The United States only sends 17% of its exports to Canada. So his conclusion, Canada needs the U.S. far more than the U.S. needs Canada.
Well, on paper, that might sound devastating for Canada, and that's what Lutnick wanted people to think. But here's what that framing completely misses. It measures the size of the flow, not the nature of what's flowing.
Yeah, and that is the critical distinction here, because what Canada sends south isn't consumer goods. It isn't things that you can replace with a phone call to a different supplier. What Canada sends south is the infrastructure of the American economy itself.
And what is that? Well, energy, critical minerals, integrated manufacturing components, parts embedded so deeply into American production lines that pulling them out doesn't just slow things down, well, it stops them.
And Lutnick standing there telling the world exactly where that dependency lives? Well, that was the moment Canada's hand got stronger in CUSMA negotiations, not weaker.
Now, let's talk about that 76% figure for a second, because Washington has been using it like a weapon all year long, but it deserves a real response.
It does. The number, it's accurate, yes. 76% of Canadian exports go to the U.S., and that's real dependency, and nobody here is pretending that that isn't.
But the reason that number exists is also the reason Canada has leverage, because Canada built that trade relationship because it was supplying things the U.S. needed, not because the U.S. was doing Canada a favor.
Yeah, the oil flowing through pipelines into American refineries, the potash going into American soil to grow American food, the aluminum and steel woven into American cars, American buildings, and American infrastructure.
Now, that is not Canada being dependent. That's Canada being indispensable. And indispensable is not the same at all as vulnerable. And that's the trap that Washington walked straight into.
Because when you are the supply chain for a $30 trillion economy and you decide to start looking elsewhere, well, the consequences don't land softly. They land at $1 billion a month and counting.
So before we get into what Canada is actually doing with that leverage, and this is where it gets very interesting, let's name something the major U.S. networks are almost completely ignoring.
Yeah, the U.S. is losing this confrontation right now. Not eventually, but right now. And the proof is hiding inside the statements coming out of Washington itself.
When a government is winning a trade confrontation, its officials speak with confidence. They announce deals and they name the concessions that they extracted from us. But what we're hearing from the U.S. side? Insults, frustration, tantrums, accusations that Canada is running the worst strategy. Well, that tells you exactly who's under the real pressure in this negotiation. They're freaking out, and it's not Canada.
Yeah, so what has Canadian resistance actually cost the United States? Let's put real numbers to it. The consumer boycott alone. Canadians choosing Canadian products, cutting U.S. travel, redirecting spending. That is running over $1 billion a month in lost trade on the U.S. side.
$1 billion a month from a country that was supposed to be too economically cornered to fight back. And that was just the average citizens fighting back.
Yeah, and only on the consumer side. Provincial governments have been pulling contracts, redirecting procurement, and making it structurally harder for U.S. companies to operate in Canadian markets.
So Lutnick calls this Canada's worst strategy. Well, think about that for a moment. A country that is supposedly desperate and dependent is costing the most powerful economy on earth $1 billion a month. The full strategy hasn't even started yet. That line right there should be making Washington very uncomfortable.
Yeah, now, here's where Canada's position fundamentally changes the game going forward.
The assumption baked into Trump's entire pressure campaign was that Canada had nowhere else to go. That the 76% dependency was a ceiling. That Canada's only real option was to accept whatever U.S. terms were made. And we should be grateful.
And Mark Carney flew to China. Not for a photo opportunity, but for real trade conversations with the second largest economy on Earth.
And the India deal is moving along, a target of $70 billion in bilateral trade by 2030. Canada is now inside Europe's emerging security architecture, and relationships that Washington assumed Canada would never risk building are being built right now in real time this year.
And the message that sends to every multinational corporation deciding where to invest over the next decade is unmistakable. Canada is open, Canada is stable, and Canada is building.
Listen, capital doesn't care about political arguments. Capital goes where it finds stability and predictability. And right now, Canada is the stable address.
The United States, with its tariffs reversals and its constant renegotiation threats, is the unpredictable address. That contrast is being noticed all around the world, and it's costing Washington in ways that don't show up in a single press conference.
And then there's CUSMA, or as the Americans call it, USMCA. It's the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, which Trump made, by the way. It is the deal that Trump keeps threatening to scrap or reimagine.
So every time that Washington makes that threat, they believe that they're applying pressure to Canada. But what they're actually doing is telling every company with a North American supply chain to start planning for uncertainty.
Because when a company doesn't know whether the trade rules will change next quarter, it doesn't double down on U.S. investment. It diversifies. It asks what a Canadian production base looks like without the instability attached.
Which means the CUSMA threats are quietly doing Canada's work for it. Washington is accelerating the exact investment diversification that Canada has been trying to build.
And Lutnick's team hasn't figured it out yet. That's why he's so frustrated, and that's why he told us we suck. Because they're still operating on the assumption that threats equal leverage. But you know what? Threats only create leverage when the other side has no other options.
And Canada has options, more of them every single week. And the US gave Canada the time to build them by moving loudly instead of decisively.
So let's name what is actually happening here, because it matters for where Canada goes from this point. The United States spent decades assuming that Canadian compliance was automatic, that the economy integration was so deep, the dependency so total, that Canada simply would not push back in any meaningful way.
What the last several months have proven is that assumption was completely wrong. Canada pushed back. The boycotts held. The government held. The public held. And the economic damage to the U.S. is documented and it's real.
That permanently changed the negotiation position, not for just this round, but for every conversation Canada has with Washington from here forward.
Because Washington now knows that Canada will absorb economic pain rather than surrender economic sovereignty. That is a fundamentally different Canada than the one they thought they were dealing with and the ones that they were dealing with in the past.
It's a Canada that attracts global investment, builds parallel trade relationships, and demonstrates it can withstand U.S. pressure without capitulating. That Canada is not accepting a subordinate role in North America. That Canada is an independent economic power making sovereign decisions.
This is what Lutnick accidentally confirmed when he went looking for Canada's weaknesses and found its supply chains instead.
The verdict to all this is the United States went into this trade confrontation believing the dependency ran one way. Well, they're learning at $1 billion a month that it runs both ways, and that the Canadian side of that equation is far more strategic than anyone in Washington anticipated.
Listen, the weapon was always there. Canada just needed Washington to draw attention to it. Now, the question isn't whether Canada has leverage. The question is what Canada does with it from here.
So we want to know what you think. Does Canada push for a full renegotiation of CUSMA from a position of strength now?
Or does Ottawa play the long game and let the investment diversification do the work for them?
It's two very different strategies. The one Canada chooses in the next 6 months will define this relationship for the next 30 years.
So let's hear from you. Let us know what you think in the comments because we definitely want to hear from you.
And if you found this video helpful, make sure to subscribe and click on that bell so you get notifications because we put up new videos every single day.
And check out the pinned comment down below if you want to help support the channel by joining the A-Team. Check out our Substack and the merch store.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.